This year, the Authors and Innovators Business Ideas Festival theme is Changemakers. The time is now. This session will address social innovation as strategy. We designed this panel because today more than ever, social innovation and entrepreneurial mindsets are required to create and thrive in this time of disruption and uncertainty. There are many threads that connect the three panelists, but the one that is most important for you to know is that all three of them have been change-making for a very, very long time. And this is how they live into their lives and how they contribute fully and disruptively in the spheres that they influence. They each create and live by a set of principles and values that allows them to maintain and provide the energy needed to take on the issues they care most about. Cheryl Hiller is the Director of Design Integration and Professor of Practice and Innovation Design at Arizona State University. She is the author of the Intergalactic Design Guide, Harnessing the Creative Potential of Social Design. She started the first MFA in Social Innovation at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. Her successful design of this program led her to yet another role as a change leader at ASU. Cheryl is a wise counsel to business leaders, innovators, and change makers, and social innovation is the strategy that she incorporates. Daquan Oliver, CEO of WeThrive, is an Ashoka Fellow and Echoing Green Fellow. Daquan started his entrepreneuring at age 7 and has not stopped since. His lived experience as a child growing up in New York City fueled his life's work as a social innovator. As a student at Babson College, Daquan was one of the most curious and empathetic souls I had the honor to work with. He would always pop into my office and test many of his ideas with us. He was prototyping, experimenting all the time. He started WeThrive to change the way young leaders from underestimated communities are identified, elevated, and provided ongoing support along the pathway to economic prosperity. Dave Stangis is the founder of 21C Impact and co-author of 21st Century Corporate Citizenship, a practical guide to building a successful business in the modern day, as well as the companion book for the CEOs called The Executive's Guide to 21st Century Corporate Citizenship. Dave has been on the board of Net Impact for most of its growth and has been an entrepreneur in residence at Babson College, where he spends a great deal of time advising, guiding, and sometimes investing in our students. From Intel to Campbell Soup Company, Dave was one of the pioneers of corporate social responsibility and sustainability, where social innovation strategies became business strategies. And so I'm very excited to have all three of you here. And I'd like to turn it over to Daquan to give us a little bit about who you are, Daquan, and what calls you to do what you do.
Thanks, Cheryl. Appreciate rejoining you after these years at Babson. So a little about myself. So, my change-making journey really began, as you mentioned a moment ago, at Babson, right? So, sorry, at 7, when I was 7. Very simply, my mother told me I just couldn't have a toy, right? It just wasn't in the budget, couldn't afford it. And as a 7-year-old, you really just don't hear that. You just hear like, I can't have the toy. And so I had seen, a bunch of individuals buy this thing called penny savers, which, are just free newspapers with coupons in them. Sold them to anyone I saw, eventually bought the toy. And in my mind, I remember vividly as a 7-year-old, like, I don't know what that thing was, but I'm going to keep doing it. And to me, it wasn't selling newspapers. It was a brain pathway around this problem that I had already seen, the way I had come across it. And years later, what would resonate is in that moment, I didn't actually truly understand that it was thanks to everyone else that I was able to buy that toy, right? These were free newspapers. And so that in its reflection sense is really captures, one, the mindset, very action oriented, but then 2, the understanding of who I do it with, right? Which is a wider community of individuals that has most influenced my change making journey. All the way to Babson when I founded WeThrive. WeThrive is equipping underestimated youth to own their future. Effectively, we are a youth incubator where youth of the most disenfranchised communities will create ventures of their own, starting from a very own problem that they see in their community around others, see it all the way into fruition. And when they're ready to launch, we then issue out seed funding.
And just one thing I want to clarify, you mentioned a lot that this is not a typical go into a community and have a business plan competition and a hackathon. There's a real distinction in what you're doing. Can you just make that distinction so that people online don't see this as just going into a community and activating kids to change, that you actually see it very differently?
1000%, right? And I always actually anchor around, imagine if each of us are kids in a classroom, right? And a teacher comes in and they say, hey, everyone here, David, Cheryl, each of you, you're going to create a company. Sorry, there's an asterisk. Only the one with the best presentation is going to create that company. All of a sudden, automatically, who just checked out are D and C students, right? Amongst a bunch of other students in that class who have already been told in so many different ways that they are not as good as those A and B students. The last thing that they should be hoping for is that they're going to win some business plan competition than students that they've been routinely told and demonstrated they're not, quote unquote, as good as. For us, this is about one, economic opportunity, and two, community autonomy for those who have been long-time disenfranchised, right? And versus, I think, a previous model, to your point about differentiation, that outcome cannot be achieved solely by business competitions, especially ones that perpetuate the idea that only one of us can make it and we need to compete against each other to get there. Instead, what we anchor on is truly at the foundation, who even gets access to economic outcomes, economic pathways. And if from the very beginning, you've already told some 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds that this isn't for you, then we're going to continue to see the same problems that many of the cities that we work with face, which is that even when we have 18 plus programs, business programs, they have a strong challenge in getting the community members to even take advantage of those things because it's already been too late. And so instead, we start from an equitable platform where everyone can participate in that way. And there's a lot of other things that, a little more in the weeds there. But at our core, the thing that we've always differentiated on is truly how are we putting our students on pathways of economic prosperity? And though we're in education, and I think that's the thing that may sometimes feel like, oh, that's been done. We're just an educational intervention for economic prosperity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Cheryl, I'd love you to tell us a little bit about your pathway. And so what's your history and your story a little bit?
Thank you, Cheryl, and Daquan and Dave. It's wonderful to be here with you. My story begins with the fact that I was dreadfully nearsighted when I was a kid, and while everybody in Western Pennsylvania was out catching a football or a baseball, I stayed home and colored because I couldn't see the ball coming. And that I attribute to my beginnings wanting to be a painter and an artist. And then I got a job because I needed to earn some money, and I fell in love with business. I got a job at a design agency. And this whole notion of being a creative person attached to business was really just magnetic for me. And that was the beginning of a lot of changes. I've been a designer my whole life. And what you realize as you begin to work in design is that you have a lot of power, right? As a designer, there are things that you can do that will sell more products. There are things that you can think of that will change a culture. And I used to say at a certain point in my life when I was working for a lot of corporations that we all know, that after a lot of years, what I knew best was how to make people want things. And at a point, I sort of woke up to the fact that I had this power to make people want things, and then I also had a responsibility for what I made them want. And sort of a crisis and wandering in the desert for a little bit of time, thinking about how I could integrate what mattered to me into what I was doing. At the time, there was no path, right? I was a corporate designer, and I had these desires to make it more than what it was, and to make it more meaningful and more useful for the world. So at that point, I just had to start making stuff up. Design is working backwards, right? In design, we think about where we want to end up. We imagine that as fully as possible, and then we start thinking about what we have to do to make that happen. And because there was no path to become a designer in the social world, I just started hanging out with people that were breaking all the rules, with Eric Herzman, who founded Ushahidi, and with Eben Bayer, who founded Ecovative, but people that were just on a completely different course to create value for people rather than just creating money. And then I realized that there wasn't a way to learn this, and that led to founding a graduate program teaching people to use design to solve social problems. And that, led to writing a book because I wasn't sure what I was doing, so I had to try to put it in writing. And all these things that, in when you're very young, they're sort of random and experimental. And as you get older and as you realize how to build things, right, they become more intentional. And so now what I'm doing at Arizona State University is thinking about how to make this kind of design, which is a process, right? It's not an ingredient, it's not a craft, it's a process that anybody can use. How do I make it accessible and meaningful and relevant to engineers and to people in the business school and to scientists? And how do I make this available to the people who really most need the agency to create change in their life and who don't have power and who need it?
Terrific. And you do this in every single sector. You're working with people from startups to academics to social entrepreneurs. You're working on a lot of social issues. You started an organization called Measured, looking at the role of design in healthcare outcomes. You're working with foster youth. So this social design process is across every single domain of life.
It is across every single domain of life, and it needs to be, the bridge to people entering it needs to be calibrated for each discipline. Engineers understand it in a certain way, business people understand it in a certain way. Working with foster youth, right? They're just so open to it and so excited for it, and it's a creative process that they haven't had access to before. But yes, it is. The process is the same.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Dave, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Cheryl.
Excellent. Well, I would really love you to talk a little bit about your journey and then maybe start talking a little bit about the practice of what you have created over the years of being in Intel and Campbell Soup. And I think across all three of our panelists is a lived experience, which has in two of the cases ended up in books in terms of a framework and a process, because these are practices, frameworks, and processes that anyone can do, which I'm excited about. So tell us about you.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. It's really interesting to hear, and I know Cheryl, the other Cheryl as well, and I haven't met Daquan until today, but how similar we are. I mean, number one, we are three completely different people that come to this panel from different directions entirely. But what we do is there's a lot of similarities, and I'm always surprised when I hear them kind of described the way we have. And it's been a lot of fun. I've already had two conversations this morning, even before this panel. One with this huge global conglomerate company, and another one with a colleague over in Barcelona. That there's people struggling with the challenge of how to drive change in a meaningful way, and translate all of the signals we're hearing in the marketplace today around sustainability or climate or social unrest, transparency and trust every day, that I think a lot of people can help. We're not the only three uniquely qualified, or the four. But if we can shorten that cycle, that's what we do. Most of the work I do is basically free. I wish it wasn't, but it is. We help people and we help companies, and that gives me a lot of meaning. And that's a little bit of the story. And right now, after leaving Campbell, I'm, as you mentioned, Cheryl, working with some startups, few nonprofits, but a lot of great big companies that are, I'm enjoying it because they're in all different sectors now. I'm spending 10 or 12 years in tech and then 10 or 12 years in food. It's kind of fun now to be working with finance and technology and, food, as well as energy, all kinds of great sectors now. It's a lot more fun.
There's two common themes between all three of you, and I'm going to just go to Cheryl before I hop over to Daquan, because Cheryl, you've taught me a lot about the notion of using language, and you just mentioned it, Dave, which is why I want to riff off of that, because the language we use actually drives the behaviors that we want to see. And I'll never forget in the book that we wrote, Leading for Social Change, that you used the term with your board at Campbell's destination goals. You didn't look at 5-year plans. You didn't do a 1-year plan. You said, here are our destination goals. And we had so many people say, what does he mean by destination goal? And you basically said, this is the direction we want to move. We're not sure how long it'll get here, but this is our destination. That's a reframe inside the business mindset. So, and I want to get to you in a minute, Daquan, around the language you use around youth. But Cheryl, you have so much to say about language because that's a big part of your work. Can you just talk a little bit about language?
That's very funny that I have so much to say about language. Yes. And there's so much, because I'm doing a big piece of research now. Looking at, you talked about measured, right? My desire to quantify what difference design makes and find a way to help people talk about it that actually measures its effect so that it can be better understood and refined. As I've spent time looking for the most upstream place to begin calibrating the effectiveness of design and thinking about how to help people use it better, the most upstream place is the language we use to say what we're going to do, because that's a commitment we make. It is the action plan for everything that happens after it. And so when I work with organizations or founders, I always begin helping them find the words to say what they're going to do that will actually lead to the change they want to create.
Thank you. So Daquan, when I was reading a lot, I've known you from the day that you started Recesspreneurs at Babson, which was a recess program for middle schoolers. And I will never forget seeing some of those middle schoolers come and address some of the problems that they had, particularly around bullying and other issues. But you use terms, instead of under-resourced, you use underestimated. I've never heard that used before. I love underestimated. You use the notion of education as a constellation of perfect moments, transformative moments. And these are the ways you move people. Can you talk a little bit about the language you use? Give us 2 or 3 examples and why that language in terms of driving change.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny you bring up Recesspreneurs first, right? Those are the days. Recesspreneurs actually is still WeThrive. And that was the first language change, right, that we made in our history of the organization. Recesspreneurs was something that I had to make up in a college dorm where I was like, this makes sense. And that is the last thing and way you should come up with a title or a name. And it had all kinds of flaws in the program. Biggest of which was that our youth did not like Recesspreneurs, right? For each and every one of them, they did not want to be thought of as like little kids that were in recess. Nor were they thought of like that in the program. And so I'll anchor this around all of our language change is actually focused on our community and what is important for our values and our own destination as well, and where we need to be as an org. That's how we switched to WeThrive, right? Oh, coincidentally, so you see never not repping. And so you see there in the middle, there's a we, right? Long story short, we decided on, we wanted something that emphasized instead something about greatness and achieving great things. When we looked around in the space, both in education, especially in entrepreneurship at the time, a lot of the messaging was really kind of like, look how cute these kids are for doing this like cool thing, right? But especially when it comes to entrepreneurship, kids are creating real companies, right? So they should really be looking like mini powerhouses, right? And that was something that when we were speaking with them, getting feedback from them, was something that they wanted, right? They didn't want to be, looked at as just like this smiley, cute kid that went through a program, but actually as someone that had value themselves. So Thrive was the biggest part to represent that we partnered on with our youth and that language piece. And the other piece about it was hiding the we in it, right? So we thrive. The other piece that when we came together and thought about what it means to thrive, we looked and said, you know what, any one individual can achieve great things and do good, but to truly thrive takes a community, takes a we. So the very inception of We Thrive from Resourcepreneurs itself, interestingly enough, was a very intentional language choice. And then the last item that I'll also talk to on with language is then how I describe the organization today. And that is, as you mentioned, equipping underestimated youth. And that, thank you for bringing that up. The team took like 8 different months to think of that individually, just because our dissatisfaction with the ways in which I think the social sector traditionally identifies and looks at our community, especially a community that I'm from, is really use all kinds of deficit language, right? From under-resourced to impoverished to poor to at risk, all things that no one would want to be identified as, right? The last thing you would want to be known as someone that's at risk. Now, within that, what we instead saw as the problem, regardless, around language, to Cheryl's point, was the ways in which, it was meant to actually say, hey, these are individuals that need support and resources, but it was actually filtering the kind of resources they were getting, right? So the kind of resources, especially in the educational setting, that are typically provided to at-risk youth versus youth who are wealthy, meant for greatness one day, tended to be completely different resources. One needs to look no further than these schools funded by the exact same donors, right? And that's an age-old argument and conversation that you look at in the charter system to see the different kinds of private schools funded by the same funder for disenfranchised communities versus wealthier communities. Entrepreneurship was no different. In wealthier communities, it was almost a given that they would create the real thing and they can go that far. But as soon as we were talking about quote unquote at-risk communities, they were all of a sudden only capable of creating a business plan and of doing a business pitch. And so what we saw was like, the problem is the audience member. They are the ones underestimating the community and the youth. And so, again, those are the 2 examples I bring up, which again, for us, one of the biggest things that we come back to is within our mission of community ownership and pathways of prosperity, what are the language and really to both of the points that you and Cheryl had made, that allow us to traverse that route or give the wrong weight and then guide the kind of actions that we're doing in a completely wrong direction.
So I want to ask you something. Would you, I've been reading, are you more of a tech company? Because you basically have created platforms created by the community for communities as a tech platform. Can you I just want to understand that you're a tech company, first and foremost, a tech education company?
Yes. So it's something that, when you hear our work, it's so intentional around like the direct person that you can easily miss that we are an ed tech company at the end of the day, right? And so that's what's allowed us to work with so many school districts, work with city partners as well, from mayors to economic development departments. And then of course it ends, it's the midway then between the school, the principal, the teacher, and the student. But at the end of the day, we are an ed tech company. That's what's allowed us to maintain strong quality assurance. And so there's a lot within there, but the main thing that happens is that the tech also allows us to know in real time, right? What is going on? Does a student need help, et cetera? There's a lot to say about the tech, but I will just anchor around the fact that everything that we do is built within that web and mobile app platform.
Yeah, no, it's really quite amazing how you've intentionally built every single aspect into a feedback loop. And again, to what Cheryl and Dave talk about is that, the problems are best solved by the people in the community that feel they have problems or have opportunities. And you've been so empathetic and listened and been there every step of the way. Even when you thought you had an idea, you really always went back to the community. So for both, Cheryl and Dave, I'd love an example. Because Dave, you talk a lot about that, when you're inside of a company driving change like the Campbell Soup Company, you're really not doing it alone. There is no way your work can thrive or survive if you aren't working with just about every other business unit. And I'd like to read a quote because I think it's such an important quote, not just about responsibility, but a quote about your book from the CEO of Bose. At Bose, we're best known for our audio products, but our true passion, discovering new and better solutions than anything that's come before. We always dream of things that are better and think of ways to reach those things. 21st Century Corporate Citizenship is a handbook that can help business people understand how to dream and implement better and more sustainable futures for their companies and for us all. I love the notion, taking away from corporate social responsibility, that citizenship is really about empowering people, even inside your organizations, to dream. And to do that requires a process. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think it builds on some of the things that have been said before, and trying to take that language theme a little bit further. You're right. I mean, people would ask me, and I'd get interviewed, and they would want to know the size of my team. And I said, well, my team may be like 3 to 10 people, but my goal is to have 20,000 people working for me, or not working for me, but working on the agenda I'm trying to build up at Campbell, or 50,000 or 80,000 people at Intel. And that takes it takes an ability to really listen. Number one, people in my field spent years trying to convince people to do things the right way, or to do the right things for social sustainability for people, communities, or the planet. That doesn't work. I mean, you can get some traction through preaching, but for the most part, you have to understand what people's drivers are. You have to listen to what the CEO or the CFO or the general counsel or the person that's running manufacturing or sales or marketing, what's important to them? What are they trying to drive? These are good people. They're smart. They're intelligent. They've just been incentivized over and over and over to work a certain way. And sometimes that isn't the most effective when you're trying to drive change in an organization, but you have to understand what is driving them. You have to understand their point of view. You have to understand how to help them. And, at a big company, if I can get every one of these major functional or operational leaders to tell me how they are trying to move their own agenda forward, their own function, their own P&L, profit and loss, I can help them. I can use the signals I'm seeing in the marketplace or with people or consumers to actually accelerate their work. So they are all, in an ideal world, they are all operating faster and more effective using the tools I'm bringing to them from a sustainability or social sustainability perspective, transparency or trust perspective. And that's what win-win is. I don't need to convince them to think like me. I don't need them to believe in the things that I believe in. I just want us all on the same page to make whatever company or nonprofit or agency or whatever entity we're working in, make it the best it can be on the planet. And I was very clear to the leadership at Intel once I had their trust, and to the leadership at Campbell when I joined, that my goal was to come and make the company not the best food company, but the best company it could be. None of them believed me on day one, but I think they understood over time what I was trying to do, and that works with every leader. It also is really empowering to people that work for me, or the people that I'm, when you're driving purposeful work in a big enterprise, you attract other purposeful people. They knock on your office, or they knock on your desk, and they say, can I join you? Right? I'm in this other group, but I love the work you're doing. And it's another great way. It reminds me of the kind of language Daquan just used. People aspire to be underestimated. I would love to be underestimated by people. It's a great to be an underdog. And there's no better feeling in the world to, under promise and over deliver. And the more of those things we can unlock, both at the individual perspective and inside companies, the better.
Thank you, Cheryl. I'd love you to share one example, but then and then you can start, and I'll go around to Dave and Daquan. I'd love you to talk about, to be specific. You've taught me how to be specific. And so to be specific in just a few practices or clear principles when you're thinking about change and social design. Just a couple of things that people who are listening to this can start to think about that they may not be thinking about.
Sure. there is no change at the level that we've all been speaking about that is not related to complex problems, right? They are interrelated human problems that involve human agency and human relationships. And and this all goes back to language, right, by the way, because language is the way that we form relationships. And in this kind of complex problem, there is no single part of the problem that can affect change. It takes diverse ways of seeing the world. It takes diverse kinds of expertise. And what this means is that one of the principles for how people are able to come together and collaborate is, number one, a shared vision. It's the articulation of a vision that is big enough and exciting enough for everyone to see themselves in it and to see what they want to do. It takes a set of human skills, right? People fret a lot about, do I need an engineer, or what kind of engineer do I need on this team? And do we need an anthropologist? And do we need somebody from sales or marketing? In the end, that's much less important than that everybody on the team share the human skills of collaboration, of critical thinking, of creativity, of communication. So that's another one of the principles. We talked about the idea of working inside out, right? That, forgive all the people I'm going to offend with this, but outside experts never can work from inside the company, right? You can't bring a solution from somewhere else and just impose it on a culture. And I can't imagine how many billions of dollars have been spent trying that, right? So the change has to begin from not only within an organization, but even from the inside of people. And then another principle, which is a big one, which is that real change comes not by planning it in advance, because we can't know. Real change comes from experimentation, thoughtful experimentation, where we take a step and we see what happens, and then we react based on the needs of the system. So all of the notion of 5-year plans, they're not meaningful anymore. And what we need is a safe process to be in a trusted environment and experiment and act our way to change, as everyone we know says and believes.
Oh, thank you so much. Daquan, it is not easy to be an Ashoka Fellow. For those of you who don't know, Ashoka is the most prominent and oldest and most well-respected intermediary organization of the most powerful social entrepreneurs on the planet. It was founded by Bill Drayton. And to be an Ashoka Fellow is a very rigorous process, probably over a year process. When you went through that process, Daquan, can you talk a little bit about the things they saw in you and that you've been practicing that allowed you to be in this esteemed group? Because it is not easy to be in this group, and we are so proud that you are.
Key things that were incredibly important were, what do I understand about the problem that no one else does? I remember that being a huge focal point, right? One of the biggest things I continuously bring out is that the construct of mobility, as is commonly understood, is a facade and is not current with today, right? This fake notion that born into a cycle of poverty, and so if you receive more quality education, you could receive better quality job, and then you have more wealth, and then that child is now born into a new cycle of prosperity, is not the route of a person coming from the most disenfranchised communities, right? So, for example, even when I got to Babson, right, I had to face all kinds of other just stereotypes, etc., just to get through to that next point, right? So you have like little detours, right? My first weekend on campus, someone had assumed I had a scholarship because I was on campus from New York. That was not the case. And if you aren't preparing for that within that journey along mobility, socioeconomic mobility, then it's not a real intervention or set of interventions, I should really say. That's just a brief example of the kind of thing of like how in depth I think what they were looking for is, because those are directly things that we address within WeThrive. One organization cannot do it all, but to David's point, we're not necessarily looking to do it all ourselves, but we're looking to make sure that we are able to spur a drastic change within the system, so that, you know, it's not just about who and what WeThrive is doing, but now this wider movement.
Okay, Dave, I'd love you to just end with a couple of the practices or values that would be really important. And the reason that I want us to sort of leave with some concrete things, because this whole panel on social innovation as strategy is really happening because we're living in a really different time. We're living in a very unpredictable, disruptive time. And I can imagine that most people aren't going back to a normal, and they're going to have to be in a dynamic state for a long time.
It's negotiation and influence, a lot of what we're trying to do. And those sound like power words, but that's not the way it happens day to day. What happens day to day is seeking to understand what other people or stakeholders or groups want. And not just what they think they want, what they really want. Like, what does success look like for them? And I'll ask almost everybody point blank that question. Like, what is it? Not, don't tell me what you, I mean, you can tell me what you want, but wind the clock ahead to some time that you want to set, 1 year, 3 year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. What does success look like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? I mean, what is the essence of that success? And I always find commonality. I find so much more commonality than when people want to fight or debate. When they actually describe to me, even if, like I said, going back to the business example, what do you want? What does success look like, CEO? I remember the first time I asked Doug Conan that. I was still interviewing for the job, and he was the CEO of Campbell Soup at the time. And I worked with him to set those big, hairy, audacious goals that Cheryl mentioned at the very beginning. And he said, I don't know. I don't know what success looks like. And that's, one of the reasons we're hiring that, one of the reasons they're looking for somebody. I wasn't happy with that answer. So I said, so who do you want? Like, let's pretend we're successful. Like, who cares? Like, who do you want to know that we're a success in this space? And he told me it was, employees and his customers. But it was enough for me to then start to build pieces of the strategy. And I've done that in negotiations with, public policy people, regulators, investors, activists, people in governments around the world. And it just is really a very tactical approach to me to help me build the steps to drive that change, as small as they are. But a lot of people start on that process without ever figuring out what success looks like to the person across the table. It's just mind-boggling. But it's a very simple, I think, step, and I recommend everybody take it.
Awesome, thank you. And Cheryl, I'd love to know, given these times, you just created an incredible master's program. What are you hoping that these students will do in today's world that's different from a typical engineer, typical business student, or designer? What is this integrated program going to provide for all of us as we look at social innovation as strategy, as we look at change that is inevitable and desirable?
Thanks, Cheryl. Well, the program, first of all, is a partnership between the Schools of Engineering, Business, and Design. And it's a program that in a year takes students through an integrated process that combines learning from all those schools of launching a venture. In short, I think, and I even before he made the movie, he was really an important sort of influence in my life. Congressman John Lewis, I got to meet him. And the notion that he had of good trouble has been important to me sort of ever since I've become aware of him. And my hope for the graduates of our program, just as my hope was for the graduates of the last master's program, is that they go out into the world and infiltrate every single kind of organization at every level and make good trouble.